It was not up till recently where there is finally a contender to the Sony 200-600 for the title of Best Affordable Wildlife Lens. I know that there is a Tamron 150-500 that was released slightly earlier, but personally, I think that although it is a decent alternative for wildlife photography, it is not the best option because it only has a reach of 500mm. The Sony 200-600 is an amazing lens for its price, and it exceeded the expectations of many when it was first released. Therefore, I think it's going to be a tough fight for the Sigma, but I'm quite excited to see how it holds up against the Sony lens. If you are new to the channel, do consider subscribing for more of such content in the future. Hey guys, what's up? My name is Bernard and welcome to the channel. In today's video, I'll be testing out the Sigma 150-600 DG DN lens for the Sony E-mount system to see how it fares as a wildlife lens. Shout out to Sigma Singapore for loaning me this lens so I could make this review. However, I'd like to point out that this is not a sponsored video and I'm free to say anything I want about this lens. So with the disclaimer out of the way, let's begin this review. The first thing I want to check out is the image quality of this lens, so let's get some sample images. Here are some of my favorite images shot with this lens during my time with it. It is definitely capable of capturing amazing wildlife photos. And as usual, Sigma doesn't disappoint when it comes to image quality. In fact, it even looks slightly sharper than the images I've gotten with the 200-600. Cropping in, you could see the fine details of the animal. Now that we've established that this lens has amazing image quality, let's take a look at its autofocus performance, as that is arguably one of the most important factors when it comes to wildlife photography. For this test, I'll be pairing this lens with the A7 III. This camera body has decent autofocus performance, but there are definitely newer models out there that are superior. What this means is that if this lens could do well with this body, it can definitely do better with newer cameras like the A9 or the A1. I went out to shoot in a variety of situations to make sure that it can handle any challenge you throw at it. In this example, the subject is relatively large and moving pretty slowly in a simple environment. I would say that in this burst of images, most of them were in focus, but in some of them, you would see that the eyes are not tack sharp. In the second example, it is quite a similar situation, except that the subject is smaller and in a slightly messier environment. The bird is making sharper movements, but it is not moving around much. This can be considered a simple shooting situation, but looking at the images, you can see that although most of them are in focus, the focal point occasionally jumps to the background and foreground of the subject. For your information, autofocus area was set to zone. I wanted to be sure of my findings, so I shot another series of images of a small bird at eye level walking around in a relatively messy environment. This time, the bird was moving slightly more than the previous example, but it wasn't moving very quickly. As you can see from the results, the same thing where the focus jumps to the foreground for a couple of frames happened. For the fourth example, I decided to try a similar shot again, but this time back to a cleaner environment. The results were definitely much better under such circumstances. I think it is not so much the autofocus capabilities but more of the AI of this lens and its ability to pick out which is the subject in the frame. If this was really the case, at least it could be improved with future firmware updates, and knowing Sigma, they would probably do so like they have done before. For the fifth set of images, I went for something different. Another common situation is birds in the trees amongst the foliage. Using the autofocus area zone in such a situation is not ideal, as it sometimes mistakenly picks out the foreground as your subject, as you can see in these shots. However, if your subject is the closest to your lens, it should do fine even in a messy background. In such situations, your best bet is to use either flexible spot set to small or to use manual focus if time permits. As you can see in this set of images, the results are much better, but it is still not 100% reliable. Some shots might still go out of focus. Here is another example of a bird in an even messier environment. Once again, using the autofocus area flexible spot small gave me pretty decent results. For my 7th set of sample images, I wanted to test the autofocus tracking capabilities on a fast-moving subject. In this situation, the dog was backlit and running towards me pretty quickly. Despite that, the photos remained in focus. For the last set of images, we will be looking at animals in flight. I would like to point out that I am not experienced enough of a wildlife photographer to capture good bird in flight images. Despite that, I still managed to achieve decent results with this lens. I was even able to capture small insects in flight, which was pretty awesome. After the comprehensive testing that I did, I found that the lens would do fine in most situations. However, I must point out that in terms of autofocusing capabilities, I feel that although the Sigma is decent, the Sony lens does it better. For my fellow videographer friends out there watching this, let's now take a look at autofocus performance in video mode. I am using the A7S III for this, and autofocus area is set to flexible spot small. You can see that autofocus is able to shift to wherever I point the camera to, and although the focus shift is not the smoothest, it is still decent. Here is another example, and once again, autofocus does its job. Based on the results I have obtained so far with the Sigma lens, I can conclude that its performance is good and will probably get the job done. Now, we will discuss the specifications and features of each lens, and I think that this is what would really influence your purchasing decision. One of the biggest differences between the two lenses will be their focal length. The Sony has a decent range of 200 to 600 mm, but the Sigma has one-upped it by giving you an extra 50 mm, giving you an impressive range of 150 to 600. On the telephoto end of things, they remain equal, but in situations when you're photographing an animal and it decides to come closer, with the Sigma lens, you have more flexibility to continue shooting with it. With the Sony lens, I usually have to have a second camera body or a second lens on standby to deal with such situations. Apart from that, the Sigma has a much more impressive close focusing distance of 58 cm on the wide end and 280 cm on the telephoto end. That is definitely very useful when you're trying to take photos of a subject that is close to you. The Sony, on the other hand, has a close focusing distance of 2.4 meters throughout the whole range, and anyone with experience with this lens knows that this lens has a huge disadvantage when it comes to closer subjects. The Sony also loses to the Sigma in terms of macro capabilities, with a magnification ratio of 0.2 times, while the Sigma has a 1:2.9 and a focusing distance of 180 mm. If my math didn't fail me, that should be a magnification ratio of 0.34 times. Another significant difference between both lenses is their size, and this is going to affect portability. You will find that it is quite a challenge to find a camera bag that could accommodate the 200 to 600 lens. Out of my 6 camera bags, only 2 could do so nicely. With the Sigma lens, most bags should easily accommodate this lens. Speaking of portability, both lenses are about the same weight despite the difference in size. The 200 to 600 is 2.115 kg, while the 150 to 600 is 2.1 kg. By the way, both lenses have a 95mm filter thread, so using screw-on filters might be a challenge. Moving on to their aperture differences. On the telephoto end, the widest aperture both lenses can shoot at is 6.3. However, on the wide end, the Sigma can shoot at f5, while the Sony can only shoot at f5.6. Not that this is a game-changing difference, but that extra 1/3 stop of light might come in useful in low-light situations. Let's now look at the price difference between the two lenses. The Sony costs about $2,250, while the Sigma can be purchased for $1,725. As usual, the Sigma offers an incredible value of money for its product. If you're on a budget, the Sigma is a no-brainer option. The next thing we will look at is the features each lens have. The Sony has the regular bells and whistles like the AF/MF switch, focus limiter, stabilization mode selection, and stabilization on and off button. The Sigma lens has an additional zoom torque switch that allows you to change the zoom ring resistance. That's a pretty cool and useful feature to have. It also has additional stabilization mode options like dynamic view mode and moderate view mode. This personally doesn't matter to me, but some might appreciate it. The last thing I really appreciate about the Sigma lens is that the tripod socket is Acra Swiss compatible. That means I don't have to go through the hassle of attaching a separate base plate. However, do take note that you are not able to conveniently remove it, unlike Sony's tripod socket, which is a feature I appreciate. I also wish that it has two 1/4 inch threads instead of only one for situations where I attach a Manfrotto 501 plate, and it being a heavy lens, having 2 points of contact is better than one. As for the Sony's tripod socket, you can choose to replace it with an Acra Swiss compatible one, but that will cost you an additional $80 or so. So I know that it sounds like the Sigma is superior so far, but the Sony has a few features to justify its premium price. Earlier, I mentioned that the Sony lens is a much larger one. That is because the Sony lens has an internal zoom feature, and that means that it doesn't extend or retract when you zoom in or out. The biggest benefit of this to me is that after you have balanced your camera setup on a fluid head, like most wildlife photographers do, you won't have to rebalance it when you switch your focal length. For the Sigma, because the center of gravity shifts when you go from the telephoto end to the wide end, you have to rebalance your fluid head if you want it to be balanced perfectly. Another standout feature of the Sony lens is that you can use it with teleconverters. That is very useful when you want to get extra reach in a convenient and affordable way. I made a video about using this lens with a teleconverter, do check it out. Unfortunately, the Sigma is not compatible with teleconverters. Last but not least, the Sigma lens only has a burst rate of 15 frames per second. If you are using a camera body like the A7 III or the A7R4, this is probably not going to affect you much. However, if you are using a faster camera body like the A9 or the A1, only the Sony 200-600 can unleash its true potential, offering a burst rate of up to 30 frames per second. If you're using either of those camera bodies, it makes more sense to go with the Sony native lens to unlock its true potential. Now that we have covered all the features on both lenses, I want to talk about the real-world user experience. After using the 200-600 for slightly over a year, I really love this lens. I especially love its internal zoom mechanism because I use it on a fluid head a lot, and it's great to not have to constantly rebalance it. I also like that the throw of the zoom ring is pretty short. I can easily get from 200 to 600 with a small twist. That means my hands aren't in an awkward position when I go from the wide to the telephoto end. Videographers will also rejoice to know that manual focus on this lens is a pretty pleasant experience. Although it uses a fly-by-wire mechanism, the response is pretty accurate and responsive. As for things that I do not enjoy about this lens, the sheer size of it has made it very unpleasant to pack. It's tough to find backpacks that fit it, and even if I do, it takes up most of the space and I won't have room for other stuff. Another bothersome thing is because of this lens minimum focusing distance, each time I'm too close to a subject, I'll have to use another lens instead, which means the hassle of carrying additional gear. Other than that, I don't think I can find any other faults in terms of user experience with this lens, and it is a positive one overall. As for the Sigma lens, I have particularly enjoyed the extra 50mm range and a close focusing distance. I also found it to be really pleasant when packing my bags because of its smaller form factor. The performance of this lens has been great, and as an A7S III and an A7 III user, I am not really affected by the limited burst rate. As for what was cumbersome about this lens to me was that whenever I placed it on a fluid head and I changed focal lengths, it would not be perfectly balanced. However, when using it handheld, although the lens extends quite a bit when zooming in, it still feels okay and it is not too front heavy or anything. Another thing is that the throw of the zoom ring on this lens is rather large, which results in your hands being in an awkward position should you try to zoom from one end to the other. However, the feature of being able to zoom your lens in and out with the pump action makes up for it, and I find myself using it quite frequently. Something you might want to note is that when the zoom ring resistance is set to smooth, zoom creep will happen. When you set it to tight, it won't creep as easily, but hard impacts will cause it to creep as well. The only way to truly prevent it is to lock it. One last thing that I had an issue with was the manual focus on this lens. If you were a videographer planning to rely on manual focus on this lens, I would advise against it. You can still get usable footage with it, but it is not very responsive and has a very large throw. However, autofocus performance in video mode is good, so you can still rely on that. Other than that, I don't really have any other issues with the Sigma lens. Between the two lenses, I think that the deciding factors of which lens to go for will be determined by your budget, your need for portability, which camera body you plan to use with it, and whether or not the internal zoom is important to you. That pretty much summarizes my thoughts on both lenses. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and found it useful. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you did. That's it for today. It's a wrap!